Miss Marple's Creaking Gate. The Sound That Betrayed a Murderer. Chapter 1. The Whisper of the Gate, in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the days unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-worn novel. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with the evening's calm. The roses outside her cottage glowed faintly in the twilight, their petals catching the last of the sun's golden rays. But it was not the roses that held her attention tonight. It was the gate, her old iron garden gate, weathered by years of rain and wind, which had begun to creak in a most peculiar way. Miss Marple's cottage stood at the edge of her modest garden, its boundary marked by that very gate, which led to a narrow lane separating her property from the imposing Langley Manor. The manor, with its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys, was home to the Langley family, wealthy, reclusive, and, as Miss Marple had long observed, not without their secrets. She had always found people to be like her knitting patterns, simple at first glance, but full of knots and tangles when you looked closer. The creak came again, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the stillness. Miss Marple's needles paused. It was not the usual groan of rusted hinges, the kind that sang of neglect and time. This was a higher, almost musical note, as if the gate had been touched by a careful hand. She set her knitting on the table and adjusted her spectacles, her sharp eyes peering through the lace curtains. The lane was empty, save for the shadows of the elms swaying in the breeze. But the creak had been real, and Miss Marple was not one to dismiss the unusual. She rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and stepped onto her porch. The air carried the scent of lavender and something else, something acrid, like burnt paper. Her gaze drifted to the Langley Manor, where a single light flickered in an upstairs window. Then, from beyond the hedge, came voices, low, urgent, and unmistakably angry. A man's voice, sharp with accusation, cut through the night. "You've gone too far this time." A woman's reply followed, softer but laced with venom. "You'll regret this, Victor." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Victor Langley, the patriarch of the family, was known for his temper and his fortune, both of which seemed to attract trouble. She strained to hear more, but the voices faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, and there it was again, the creak of the gate. This time it was accompanied by the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, retreating toward the manor. She returned to her chair, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Gates, she knew, were more than mere entrances. They were thresholds, witnesses to comings and goings, and sometimes to secrets best left buried. The creak was new, and new things in St. Mary Mead often meant trouble. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her thoughts were no longer on the scarf taking shape in her hands. They were on the gate, its strange new voice, and the argument that had drifted across the lane. As the clock struck 9, she made a mental note to pay closer attention to the Langley household. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple had a knack for sensing when the threads of village life were about to unravel. The creaking gate, she suspected, had just whispered its first clue. Chapter 2. A Body in the Rose Garden. The morning sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive cheer, casting golden rays across the dew-kissed lawns and thatched roofs. Miss Jane Marple, already awake with her cup of tea, was pruning her roses when the first whispers of trouble reached her ears. It began with the hurried footsteps of young Tommy, the butcher's boy, sprinting down the lane with a face as pale as milk. "Miss Marple!" he gasped, pausing at her gate, which gave its now familiar creak as he leaned against it. "It's Mr. Langley, Victor Langley. They've found him dead in his garden." Miss Marple's pruning shears stilled, and she fixed Tommy with a calm but piercing gaze. "Dead, you say? Where exactly?" Her voice was gentle, but her mind was already racing, recalling the heated voices and that odd creak from the night before. "In the rose garden, behind the manor," Tommy replied, catching his breath. "The groundskeeper, Mr. Hodges, found him just now. Says he's lying among the roses, stiff as a board. The police are on their way." Miss Marple nodded, setting her shears down. "Thank you, Tommy. Run along and don't spread too much panic, dear." As the boy dashed off, she glanced toward the Langley Manor, its chimneys just visible over the hedge. The rose garden, she knew, was tucked behind the manor, a secluded spot where Victor often retreated to smoke his pipe and brood over his ledgers. A body there was no accident. It was a statement. By mid-morning, the village was humming with gossip. Miss Marple, never one to join the clamour, made her way to the manor's edge, where a small crowd had gathered near the lane. The police had cordoned off the garden, and Inspector Crane, a portly man with a moustache that seemed to bristle with self-importance, was barking orders through the manor's wrought-iron gate. Silent now, Miss Marple noted. She caught a glimpse of the rose garden. Victor Langley lay sprawled among the crimson blooms, his face frozen in a grimace, one hand clutching a thorny stem. A strange, circular mark, almost like a burn, marred the back of his hand. Miss Marple lingered near the gate, her eyes scanning the onlookers. Clara Langley, Victor's widow, stood pale but composed, her black dress impeccable despite the early hour. Edward, their estranged son, hovered at the edge of the crowd, his jaw tight and his eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Grimsby, the housekeeper, was wringing her hands, her usual stoic demeanour fraying at the edges. And Mr. Hodges, the groundskeeper, was muttering to a constable about the state of the garden, his weathered face etched with unease. "It's a terrible thing, Miss Hartnell, the village busybody," said loudly, sidling up to Miss Marple. "They say it might be poison, or perhaps he was struck down. But who would do such a thing?" Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of scandal. "People are rarely what they seem," Miss Marple replied mildly, her gaze fixed on the manor gate. She recalled its creak from last night, sharp and distinct, and Mr. Hodges' words reached her ears. "The gate was quiet last night, I swear it. Not a sound when I checked the grounds at 10. Quiet? Miss Marple's brow furrowed. That gate had creaked twice under her window, once during the argument, and once with those retreating footsteps. Either Mr. Hodges was mistaken, or someone had tampered with the gate to silence it, or to make it sing. She tucked the thought away, like a stitch in her knitting, to be revisited later. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the path from the gate to the rose garden. The ground was soft from recent rain, and faint footprints led from the lane to the roses. Though the police seemed more interested in the body than the path, she noted the gate's hinges, gleaming faintly as if recently oiled. A small detail, but in St. Mary Mead, small details often unravelled the largest secrets. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her tea, her mind weaving the morning's observations into a pattern. Victor Langley was dead, and someone had walked through that gate last night. The creak, she suspected, was no mere quirk of iron. It was a witness, and perhaps the key to unmasking a murderer. Chapter 3. The Scent of Suspicion. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobbled lane that led to Langley Manor. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in her best tweed skirt and carrying a basket of her prized damson preserves, approached the manor's wrought-iron gate. It stood silent as she pushed it open, no creak to betray her arrival, though she noted the hinges gleamed with a fresh sheen of oil. Her lips pursed slightly. The gate, she thought, was telling its own story, and she intended to listen. Miss Marple had decided to pay a condolence call on Clara Langley, Victor's widow. It was the neighbourly thing to do, of course, but Miss Marple's visits were rarely without purpose. People, she knew, revealed themselves in moments of grief, or when they thought no one was watching. The manor's heavy oak door opened before she could knock, revealing Mrs. Grimsby, the housekeeper, whose gaunt face was drawn tighter than usual. Her eyes, red-rimmed, darted to the gate behind Miss Marple before settling on the basket. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Grimsby," Miss Marple said warmly, her voice as soothing as a cup of chamomile tea. "I've brought some preserves for Mrs. Langley. Such a dreadful shock, poor Victor." Mrs. Grimsby nodded stiffly, her hands twisting a dishcloth. "Very kind of you, Miss Marple. Mrs. Langley's in the drawing-room. I'll take you through." Her voice was clipped, and she avoided meeting Miss Marple's gaze as she led the way through the manor's dim hallway. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and something sharper, perhaps cleaning fluid or fear. The drawing-room was a study in elegance, with its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture, but it felt cold despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Clara Langley sat on a settee, her black morning dress pristine, her golden hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap. She rose as Miss Marple entered, her smile polite but strained, like a porcelain cup on the verge of cracking. "Miss Marple, how thoughtful of you to come," she said, her voice smooth but tinged with exhaustion. "My dear, I'm so very sorry," Miss Marple replied, setting the basket on a side table. She took a seat, her eyes discreetly scanning the room. A photograph of Victor Langley, stern and unsmiling, hung above the mantel, his eyes seeming to follow every movement. It must be a terrible burden, managing all this so soon after such a loss. Clara's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. "It is overwhelming. Victor was the heart of this house. We're all quite lost without him." Her words were practiced, but her eyes flickered toward the window, where the rose garden was just visible beyond the gate. The door opened, and Edward Langley strode in, his tie askew and his dark hair dishevelled. He was in his late 20s, with the restless energy of a man who preferred action to words. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, giving a brief nod. "Didn't expect visitors so soon." His tone was brusque, and he shot a glance at his mother, who looked away. "Oh, I shan't stay long," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I only wish to offer my sympathies. The village is quite shaken. Such a tragedy in the rose garden." She paused, watching their reactions. Clara's lips tightened, and Edward's hand twitched, as if resisting the urge to clench into a fist. Mrs. Grimsby re-entered with a tea tray, her movements jerky. As she poured, Miss Marple seized the moment. "I couldn't help but notice the gate on my way in," she said conversationally. "It's remarkably quiet today. I could have sworn I heard it creak last night, quite distinctly." The room stilled. Clara's teacup clinked against its saucer, and Edward's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Grimsby froze, a teaspoon hovering mid-air. "The gate?" Clara said, her voice a touch too bright. "Oh, it's always creaking. Old thing, you know. Funny, though," Miss Marple continued, as if musing to herself. "Mr. Hodges mentioned it was silent last night when he checked the grounds, yet I heard it twice, clear as a bell." She smiled benignly, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flush creeping up Mrs. Grimsby's neck, and the way Edward's fingers drummed on his knee. "Hodges must be mistaken," Edward said quickly, his voice tight. "He's getting on, probably didn't hear it. That gate's always been noisy." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "Though it's curious, isn't it? A gate that chooses when to speak." She let the words hang, noting how Clara's gaze darted to Mrs. Grimsby, who busied herself with the tray. The conversation turned to village matters, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She observed the tension between Clara and Edward, her polished restraint clashing with his barely concealed agitation. Mrs. Grimsby, meanwhile, seemed to hover like a shadow, her every movement deliberate yet nervous. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she glanced out the window at the rose garden, where police tape still fluttered. The gate stood at the edge of her vision, its silence now as telling as its creak had been. Outside, she paused by the gate, running a finger along its hinges. The oil was fresh, applied within days, she wagered. Mr. Hodges was waiting by the garden shed, his cap pulled low. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "That gate was quiet as a mouse last night, I'd swear it. On my mother's grave." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Gates have a way of keeping secrets, Mr. Hodges, but they don't keep them forever." As she walked back to her cottage, the scent of roses lingered in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of suspicion. Someone had wanted that gate silent, or perhaps they'd wanted it to sing. Either way, Miss Marple was determined to find out why. Chapter 4. Shadows at Duskers. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky over St. Mary Mead in hues of amber and violet. Miss Jane Marple set out for her evening walk. Her sturdy shoes crunched softly on the gravel path, and her shawl, knitted with the precision of years, draped comfortably over her shoulders. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster enjoying the twilight air. But Miss Marple's walks were never aimless. They were, in their quiet way, expeditions into the heart of the village's secrets. The lane beside her cottage wound past the Langley Manor, and it was there her steps led her, drawn by the memory of that peculiar creak from 2 nights prior. The manor loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Miss Marple paused near her own garden gate, her fingers brushing the iron, which gave a faint groan under her touch. She smiled faintly. Her gait, at least, was predictable. The Langley gate, however, was another matter entirely. She continued along the lane, her eyes sharp despite the gathering dusk. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint sweetness of roses from the manor's garden. As she neared the wrought-iron gate, she slowed, her ears attuned to the smallest sound. The village was quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. Then it came, a sharp, musical creak, the same note she'd heard the night of Victor Langley's murder. Miss Marple froze, her heart quickening not with fear, but with curiosity. The creak was no accident. It was too distinct, too deliberate. She stepped closer to the hedge, peering through a gap toward the manor gate. In the dim light, she saw it swing inward, just enough for a figure to slip through. The figure was cloaked in shadow, moving with the cautious haste of someone who did not wish to be seen. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path leading to the rose garden, then faded into silence. Miss Marple's mind raced. The gate had creaked again. But why? Was it a signal, a mistake, or something more sinister? She recalled Mr. Hodges's insistence that the gate had been silent the night of the murder. Yet she had heard it twice, once during the argument, once after. And now here it was again, betraying someone's passage. She considered calling out, but thought better of it. A direct approach might scare her quarry away, and Miss Marple preferred to unravel mysteries stitch by stitch. Instead, she moved quietly along the lane, keeping the hedge between her and the manor. The gate stood slightly ajar, its hinges catching the last light of day. She noted a faint smear of oil on the gravel beneath, as if someone had been careless in their maintenance. Or deliberate. She crouched, her knees protesting only slightly, and examined the ground. The gravel was disturbed, with shallow impressions that suggested hurried steps. Not heavy boots, she thought. Lighter, perhaps a woman's shoe, or a man's in a rush. As she straightened, a twig snapped behind her. She turned, but the lane was empty, the shadows deepening into pools of darkness. Her pulse quickened, but her expression remained serene. Miss Marple was no stranger to the game shadows played, nor to the secrets they hid. She took a step toward her cottage, then paused as another sound reached her ears. A faint rustle, like fabric brushing against foliage, coming from the direction of the manor's orchard. She adjusted her shawl and moved toward the sound, her steps deliberate but silent. The orchard lay beyond a low stone wall, its apple trees gnarled and bare in the early spring chill. There, in the half-light, she glimpsed the figure again, moving swiftly towards the manor's rear entrance. The figure paused, glancing back, and for a moment Miss Marple caught the glint of something metallic in their hand. A key? A weapon? It was gone before she could be certain. The gate creaked once more as the figure disappeared, a final note in the evening's strange symphony. Miss Marple stood still, her mind weaving together the threads of what she'd seen and heard. The creak was no random quirk. It was a signature, a clue left by someone who either didn't know they were leaving it or couldn't help it. She thought of Clara Langley's strained composure, Edward's nervous energy, and Mrs. Grimsby's furtive glances, and Mr. Hodges, with his claim of a silent gate. Someone was lying, or mistaken, and the gate was their betrayer. As she turned back toward her cottage, the stars beginning to prick the sky, Miss Marple felt a familiar thrill. The village of St. Mary Mead might seem sleepy, but its shadows were alive with secrets. The creaking gate, she suspected, was not just a witness to Victor Langley's murder. It was a herald, announcing the killer's every move. She would walk this lane again tomorrow, and perhaps the shadows would reveal a little more. Chapter 5. The Alibi That Crumbled. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Inside the Langley Manor, however, the atmosphere was anything but soft. The drawing room, with its heavy drapes and polished mahogany, buzzed with tension as Inspector Crane paced before the assembled household. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, a picture of harmless curiosity invited by Clara Langley to provide moral support during the police's questioning. But Miss Marple's mild blue eyes missed nothing. and her ears were attuned to every word and every silence. Inspector Crane, his moustache quivering with self-assured authority, adjusted his notebook and fixed his gaze on Clara Langley. She sat ramrod straight on the settee, her black morning dress impeccable, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Mrs. Langley," he began, his voice booming in the quiet room, "you stated you were at the St. Mary Mead Charity Bazaar the night of your husband's murder, correct? From 7 until nearly midnight." Clara nodded, her expression composed but her eyes wary. "Yes, Inspector. I was helping with the raffle stall. Dozens of people saw me there." Her voice was smooth like polished glass, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers as they brushed her handkerchief. "Indeed," Crane said, flipping a page in his notebook. "Yet Mrs. Pemberley, the vicar's wife, says she left the bazaar at 9:30 and didn't recall seeing you after 8. Care to explain?" Clara's lips tightened, but her smile remained. "Mrs. Pemberley must be mistaken. The bazaar was crowded, and I was busy with the raffle tickets. Perhaps she didn't notice me." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Mrs. Pemberley, she knew, had eyes like a hawk and a memory to match. If she hadn't seen Clara, it was unlikely Clara had been where she claimed. Miss Marple glanced at Edward Langley, who stood by the fireplace, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. His jaw was set, and his eyes flicked toward his mother with a mixture of resentment and unease. "And you, Mr. Langley?" Crane turned to Edward, his tone sharp. "You say you were at the Red Lion Inn until 11, playing cards with Mr. Carter and his lot. But Carter claims you left around 9, looking agitated. Where did you go after that?" Edward's face flushed and he shifted his weight. "I went for a walk, Inspector. Needed some air. This house—" He gestured vaguely at the room. "It gets stifling. I was back by 11, as I said." Miss Marple tilted her head, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. A walk, she thought, was a convenient excuse for a young man with no witnesses, and the Red Lion was a mere 10-minute stroll from the manor. Plenty of time to slip through the gate and into the rose garden. She recalled the creak she'd heard that night, sharp and deliberate, and the footsteps retreating afterward. Mrs. Grimsby, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her hands clasped tightly. Crane barely glanced at her, but Miss Marple noted her pallor and the way her eyes darted to the window where the rose garden lay beyond the gate. "Mrs. Grimsby," Crane said abruptly, "you were in the manor all evening, yes? Heard nothing unusual?" "Nothing, sir," Mrs. Grimsby replied, her voice low and strained. "I was in my room by 9, reading. The house was quiet." She hesitated, then added, "The gate didn't creak, not that I heard. Miss Marple's needle clicked a little faster. There it was again, the gate." Mrs. Grimsby's insistence on its silence matched Mr. Hodges' claim, yet Miss Marple had heard it twice that night. Either her ears were playing tricks, a possibility she dismissed, or someone was lying. She made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Pemberley about the bazaar and to check the Red Lion's regulars for Edward's timeline. Crane scribbled in his notebook, muttering about inconsistencies. Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the undercurrents in the room. Clara's gaze lingered on Edward, not with maternal warmth, but with a calculating edge, as if measuring his words. Edward, in turn, avoided her eyes, his fingers drumming against his thigh. Mrs. Grimsby's nervous fidgeting grew more pronounced when the gate was mentioned, her knuckles whitening around her apron. As the questioning wound down, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Such a trying time for you all," she said softly, addressing Clara. "I do hope the police find answers soon. It's curious, isn't it, how small things, like a creaking gate, can tell us so much." She smiled benignly, but her words landed like pebbles in a still pond. Clara's smile faltered, and Edward's head snapped up. Mrs. Grimsby dropped a teaspoon, the clatter loud in the sudden silence. "Just an old gate," Clara said quickly, recovering. "It's always making noise." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "though it's odd that it was silent when it shouldn't have been, and noisy when it was." She let the comment hang, then added, "I mustn't keep you. Thank you for the tea," as she left the manor, passing through the gate that now swung silently on its oiled hinges. Miss Marple's mind was busy. Clara's alibi was fraying. Edward's walk was suspiciously vague, and Mrs. Grimsby's nerves suggested more than grief. The gate, she thought, was the key. Its creak had marked the killer's path, and its silence, perhaps deliberate, hid their intent. She would need to unravel this tangle carefully, but Miss Marple was patient. In St. Mary Mead, even the smallest threads led to the truth. Chapter 6. A Letter from the Past. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of Langley Manor, casting a lattice of shadows across the oak-panelled study where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting resting idly in her lap. She had been invited back to the manor by Clara Langley, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming memorial service for Victor, but Miss Marple suspected Clara's invitation was less about sentiment and more about keeping an eye on the village's most inquisitive spinster. Miss Marple, however, was not one to waste an opportunity. The study, Victor's private sanctum, was a treasure trove of secrets, and she intended to explore it discreetly. Clara had excused herself to fetch tea, leaving Miss Marple alone with the room's heavy silence. The study smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, with shelves lined with ledgers and books on estate management. A large desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with papers, a silver inkstand, and a photograph of a younger Victor, stern but handsome, standing beside a woman who was not Clara. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the photograph, noting the woman's sharp features and the date scrawled on the back, 1905. A first wife, perhaps, or a sister. The Langley family, she mused, was a tapestry of hidden threads. As she waited, Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small drawer in the desk, slightly ajar, as if someone had rifled through it in haste. Curiosity, that most reliable of instincts, prompted her to lean forward. With a glance toward the door, she eased the drawer open, revealing a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The topmost letter, yellowed with age, bore a postmark from 20 years prior. She slipped it out, her fingers deft and silent, and unfolded it carefully. The letter was addressed to Victor in a spidery hand, the ink smudged but legible. It spoke of a grave indiscretion and a debt unpaid, hinting at a financial scandal involving a forged document and a sum of money that had nearly ruined the Langley estate. The writer, one Eliza Grimsby, pleaded for discretion, warning that exposure would destroy her family. Miss Marple's breath caught. Eliza Grimsby, surely a relation to Mrs. Grimsby, the housekeeper whose nervous demeanour and late-night walks near the gate had already piqued her interest. She tucked the letter back just as footsteps approached. Clara entered, followed by Mrs. Grimsby, who carried a tea-tray with hands that trembled slightly. Miss Marple smiled benignly, accepting a cup, but her mind was racing. The letter suggested a motive rooted in the past, a scandal that Victor might have threatened to expose. Mrs. Grimsby's eyes darted to the desk, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of panic in her expression, quickly masked by a tight smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Grimsby," Miss Marple said warmly. "You must be exhausted managing the household through all this. I noticed you out by the gate last night. Such a chilly evening for a walk." Mrs. Grimsby's teapot clinked against a cup, and a flush crept up her neck. I needed some air, Miss Marple. The manor feels so oppressive since Mr. passing." Her voice was strained, and she busied herself with the tray, avoiding eye contact. Clara, seated across from Miss Marple, sipped her tea with studied calm. "The gate's been a nuisance, hasn't it?" she said, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. "Always creaking at the wrong moment. Victor meant to have it fixed." "Curious, though," Miss Marple replied, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "Mr. Hodges insists it was silent the night of the murder, yet I heard it quite clearly. And last night, too, when I saw someone by the orchard." She let the words hang, watching Clara's fingers tighten around her cup and Mrs. Grimsby's hands freeze mid-motion. "Someone by the orchard," Clara said, her smile faltering. "Probably just Hodges checking the grounds. He's always fussing about." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Though the gate creaked so distinctly as if it wanted to be heard. It's almost as if it's telling us something, don't you think?" Mrs. Grimsby dropped her sugar tongs with a clatter, and Clara's laugh was a touch too bright. "You do have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple," she said, but her gaze flicked to Mrs. Grimsby, who was now collecting the tray with unnecessary haste. As Miss Marple took her leave, passing through the manor's silent gate, she reflected on the letter and its implication. Eliza Grimsby, perhaps Mrs. Grimsby's mother or aunt, had been entangled in a scandal Victor had known about. Had he used that knowledge to control her, or someone close to her? And the gate, with its erratic creaks, seemed to mark the comings and goings of someone with secrets to hide. Mrs. Grimsby's late-night walks, her nervousness, and her quick denial of the gate's sound were threads in a pattern Miss Marple was beginning to unravel. Back at her cottage, she sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking in rhythm with her thoughts. The letter was a clue, but the gate was the key. Its creak, she suspected, had betrayed more than a midnight wanderer. It had announced a murderer's intent, and Miss Marple was determined to hear its story to the end. Chapter 7. The Midnight Creek. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a silvery glow across the village's quiet lanes and thatched roofs. Inside her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting abandoned on the table, her eyes fixed on the garden gate beyond her roses. The night was still, save for the occasional hoot of an owl and the faint rustle of leaves. But Miss Marple was not waiting for owls. She was waiting for the creak, the sharp, musical note of the Langley Manor gate that had become the heartbeat of this mystery. After her discovery of the letter in Victor Langley's study, Miss Marple had grown certain that the gate's erratic behaviour was no coincidence. Its silence on the night of the murder, as claimed by Mr. Hodges and Mrs. Grimsby, clashed with the creaks she had heard, both then and during her dusk walk. Someone was using the gate, and its sound, or lack thereof, was a clue to their intent. Tonight she decided she would test her theory. She had left her own gate slightly ajar, its hinges unoiled to ensure a telltale groan, and positioned herself to watch both her gate and the Langley gate across the lane. She adjusted her shawl, her movements as deliberate as the stitches in her knitting. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, its rhythm steady but unhurried, much like Miss Marple herself. She had learned long ago that patience was a detective's greatest ally. The letter from Eliza Grimsby, hinting at a scandal Victor had leveraged, pointed to Mrs. Grimsby as a figure of interest. But Clara and Edward Langley's fraying alibis kept them firmly in the pattern. The gate, she suspected, would reveal who was weaving the threads of deceit. At midnight, the silence broke. A sharp creak pierced the night, not from her own gate, but from the Langley Manors. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. The gate swung inward, its hinges catching the moonlight with a faint glint of oil. A figure emerged, cloaked in a dark coat, moving with the cautious grace of someone accustomed to secrecy. The figure paused, glancing toward Miss Marple's cottage, then slipped through the gate toward the rose garden. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, but her expression remained serene. She noted the figure's height, medium, perhaps a woman or a slight man, and the way they avoided the gravel path, sticking to the grass to muffle their steps. As they passed her gate, it gave a soft groan, undisturbed by her careful trap, but loud enough to startle the figure. They froze, and in their haste to retreat, something small and metallic dropped to the ground with a faint clink. The figure hesitated, then hurried back through the Langley gate, which creaked again as it closed. Miss Marple waited, counting to 10 to ensure they were gone, then stepped onto her porch. The night air was cool, tinged with the scent of roses and damp earth. She moved silently to the spot where the object had fallen, her eyes scanning the ground. There, glinting in the moonlight, was a small brass key, its head carved with an intricate floral design, unlike any she had seen in St. Mary Mead. She retrieved the key, wrapping it carefully in her handkerchief. It was heavier than a house key, perhaps for a lockbox or a hidden compartment. Her mind flashed to Victor's study, with its cluttered desk and the photograph of a younger Victor beside an unknown woman. Could this key unlock more than a door? Perhaps a secret Victor had died to protect? Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple examined the key by lamplight. The floral design was distinctive, almost ornamental, suggesting it belonged to something valuable or private. She recalled Mrs. Grimsby's nervous glances at the desk during her visit, and Clara's quick dismissal of the gate's creaks. Edward, too, had seemed uneasy when the gate was mentioned, his alibi for the night of the murder as thin as tissue paper. The key, she thought, was a new thread in the tapestry, one that might lead her to the heart of the mystery. She sat back, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. The gate's creak had betrayed the figure's movements, just as it had on the night of the murder. Someone was using it to come and go from the manor, perhaps to the rose garden where Victor had died. The key suggested a purpose, something hidden, something worth risking discovery for. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter and the scandal it implied. Had Victor been blackmailing Mrs. Grimsby, or someone else tied to the past? And why did the gate sing for her but not for others? As the clock struck 1, Miss Marple tucked the key into a small tin in her sewing basket. Tomorrow she would visit the manor again, perhaps to inquire about the memorial service or to return a borrowed teacup. But her real purpose would be to watch, to listen, and to test the gate's voice once more. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like roses, beautiful, but with thorns that drew blood if you weren't careful. And Miss Marple was always careful. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Village. The Black Swan, St. Mary Mead's only pub, was a hub of warmth and chatter on a crisp spring evening. Its low beams and flickering lanterns cast a cosy glow over the villagers, gathered around scarred wooden tables, their voices a soft hum of gossip and laughter. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with a glass of elderflower cordial, appeared to be merely enjoying a rare outing, her knitting bag tucked beside her. But her mild blue eyes were sharp, and her ears caught every whisper that drifted through the smoky air. In a village like St. Mary Mead, gossip was as reliable as the church clock, and often more revealing. Miss Marple had come to the Black Swan with a purpose. The ornate brass key, now safely hidden in her sewing basket, and the letter hinting at a Langley family scandal had sharpened her focus on the manor's residents. The creaking gate, with its inconsistent voice, remained the mystery's heartbeat, and she suspected the villagers' tongues might hold the next clue. She sipped her cordial, listening as Mrs. Hartnell, the village busybody, held court at a nearby table, her voice carrying over the clink of pint glasses. "It's a scandal, that's what it is," Mrs. Hartnell declared, her cheeks flushed from her second sherry. "Young Edward Langley, up to his ears in gambling debts, they say, owed half the county, and Victor refused to bail him out this time. No wonder there was bad blood." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her expression one of polite interest. Edward's shaky alibi from the night of the murder, a vague walk after leaving the Red Lion, gained new weight with this talk of debts. A desperate man, she knew, might take desperate measures. She made a mental note to inquire about Edward's creditors, perhaps through Mr. Carter, the innkeeper who had contradicted his timeline. Across the room, young Lily, the barmaid, was wiping down tables, her quick hands pausing as she overheard Mrs. Hartnell. Miss Marple caught her eye and beckoned her over with a kindly smile. "Lily, dear, you must hear all sorts of things working here," she said, her tone as warm as the pub's hearth. "The village is quite abuzz about poor Mr. Langley. Tell me, has anyone mentioned that gate at the manor? It's been so noisy lately." Lily hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. "Funny you should mention the gate, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "I saw Mrs. Grimsby oiling it a few weeks back, late in the evening. I was walking home from my shift and saw her with a can, fussing over the hinges. Thought it odd, her being out so late." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her face remained serene. "Oiling the gate, you say? How curious. Mr. Hodges swore it was silent the night of the murder, and Mrs. Grimsby agreed." She tilted her head, as if pondering a trivial matter. "Did you notice anything else that evening?" Lily frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, she seemed in a hurry, like she didn't want to be seen. And I heard her muttering something about keeping things quiet. Didn't think much of it then, but with all that's happened—" She trailed off, her eyes wide. "Thank you, Lily," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You've been most helpful." As the barmaid moved away, Miss Marple's mind was busy. Mrs. Grimsby oiling the gate weeks before, the murder contradicted the housekeeper's claim of its silence, and seemed Mr. Hodges' insistence that it hadn't been touched. Had Mrs. Grimsby silenced the gate to cover someone's movements, only for it to creak again on the night of the murder? And if so, why? The pub's chatter grew louder as Mr. Carter, the burly innkeeper, joined Mrs. Hartnell's table. "Clara, Langley's no saint either," he said, his voice gruff. "Heard she was cozying up to that solicitor from London, Mr. Whitby, behind Victor's back. Wouldn't be surprised if she wanted the manor and Victor's fortune all to herself." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. An affair, if true, added another thread to the tapestry. Clara's fraying alibi from the charity bazaar, coupled with this rumour, suggested a woman with secrets and perhaps a motive. The letter from Eliza Grimsby, hinting at a past scandal, might connect to Clara as well, if Victor had been using it to control her. But the gate, always the gate, kept pulling Miss Marple's thoughts back. Its creak had marked a figure's passage the previous night, and now Lily's story suggested it had been deliberately silenced before. As she finished her cordial, Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. The pub's warmth followed her into the cool night air, where the stars glittered above the village. She walked slowly past the Langley Manor, pausing by the gate. It stood silent now, its hinges gleaming faintly in the moonlight. She reached out, giving it a gentle push. A faint creak answered, softer than before, but unmistakable. Someone had oiled it again, she thought, but not well enough to silence it. Completely back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, the brass key glinting in her hand. The village whispers had woven a pattern of debts, affairs, and a gate that spoke when it shouldn't. Mrs. Grimsby's actions, Edward's desperation, and Clara's secrets were threads converging on the rose garden where Victor had died. Which key, she suspected, would unlock more than a lock. It would unlock the truth, and the gate, with its persistent creak, was singing its secrets to anyone who would listen. Chapter 9. The Locked Room Riddle. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to the Black Swan, St. Mary Mead awoke to a fresh wave of scandal. Word spread like wildfire through the village. Langley Manor had been burgled in the night, with Victor Langley's study, the very heart of his private domain, ransacked. The news reached Miss Jane Marple as she tended her roses, delivered by young Tommy, the butcher's boy, whose breathless excitement made the petals tremble. "They say the will's gone, Miss Marple," he exclaimed, leaning against her gate, which gave its familiar groan. "Locked door and all! Someone got in and took it!" Miss Marple's pruning shears paused, her mind already threading the new crime into the tapestry of Victor's murder. "The will, you say? How very curious," she murmured, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. "And the study was locked." Tommy nodded vigorously, recounting how Mr. Hodges had found the door ajar at dawn, papers scattered, and a desk drawer forced open. Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts turning to the ornate brass key tucked in her sewing basket. A locked room and a missing will. This was no coincidence. By noon, she was at Langley Manor, invited by a flustered Clara Langley to offer a neighbour's perspective on the break-in. The manor's oak-panelled hallway felt colder today, its silence heavy with unease. Inspector Crane was already in the study, his moustache bristling as he surveyed the chaos. Papers littered the floor like fallen leaves, and the desk's central drawer bore the scars of a crude attempt to pry it open. The lock, Miss Marple noted, was intact but scratched, as if someone had fumbled with the wrong key before forcing their way in. Clara stood by the window, her black morning dress stark against the pale light filtering through the rose garden. "It's outrageous," she said, her voice tight with indignation. "Victor's will was in that drawer, and now it's gone. Who would do such a thing?" Her eyes were red, but Miss Marple detected a hint of calculation beneath her distress. Edward Langley paced near the fireplace, his hands clenched. "Probably some opportunist," he muttered, avoiding his mother's gaze. "Heard about father's death and thought they'd cash in." His tone was dismissive, but his fingers twitched, betraying his nerves. Mrs. Grimsby hovered by the door, her gaunt face paler than usual. "I locked the study myself last night," she insisted to Inspector Crane, her voice trembling. "Checked it at 10 as always. No one could have gotten in without a key." Her eyes darted to the desk, and Miss Marple followed her gaze, recalling the letter she'd found in a different drawer, one hinting at a scandal tied to Mrs. Grimsby's family. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said, her voice mild as she stepped closer to the desk. "A locked room, yet someone entered, and I heard the gate creak again last night, just after midnight." She paused, watching the room's occupants. Clara's lips parted. Slightly, Edward froze mid-step, and Mrs. Grimsby's hands twisted her apron into knots. "It's almost as if the gate announced the thief's escape," Miss Marple added, her eyes twinkling with innocent curiosity. Inspector Crane snorted, scribbling in his notebook. "Gates creak, Miss Marple. Doesn't mean they're witnesses. Likely a vagrant slipped in through a window." He gestured to the study's tall windows, one of which was slightly ajar, its latch loose but undamaged. Miss Marple nodded politely, but her mind dismissed the window theory. The scratches on the drawer suggested a key had been tried before force was used, and the gate's creak, sharp and deliberate, matched the sound she'd heard the night of the murder, and during her midnight vigil she wandered to the desk, her fingers brushing the scratched drawer. Tucked beneath a pile of papers was a small brass hinge, barely noticeable, set into the desk's underside. It was cleverly hidden, part of a secret compartment that a casual thief would overlook. Her thoughts turned to the ornate key in her possession, its floral design suggesting a lock more intricate than a standard drawer. "Did Victor keep anything valuable in the desk?" she asked, her tone conversational. "Something that might require a special key." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she answered smoothly. "Just papers and the will. Victor was meticulous about his documents." Edward shot her a glance, his jaw tightening, while Mrs. Grimsby busied herself, straightening a fallen book. As Crane droned on about fingerprints, Miss Marple knelt to retrieve a paper, her fingers probing the desk's underside. The brass hinge gave a faint click under her touch, revealing a narrow slot, a perfect fit for a key like hers. She straightened, her expression unchanged, but her heart quickened. The key, she suspected, unlocked this compartment, and the will's theft was a desperate act to conceal whatever it contained, or to destroy evidence tied to Victor's murder. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the manor gate, noting fresh oil on its hinges. The gravel path to the rose garden showed faint footprints, partially obscured by morning dew. The gate creaked softly as she tested it, its sound a haunting echo of the night before. "You're a talkative one," she murmured, to the gate, her lips curving in a faint smile. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her lamp, the brass key glinting in her hand. The break-in was no random theft. It was a calculated move, likely by someone in the manor who knew the will's importance. The gate's creak had marked their escape, just as it had marked the murderer's path. The key, the letter, and the gate were threads in a tightening net, and Miss Marple was determined to pull them taut. Chapter 10. A Motive. Unravelled, the soft glow of morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her parlour. She sat at her small oak table, a cup of tea cooling beside her, the ornate brass key from her midnight vigil resting in her palm. Its floral design caught the light, a silent reminder of the hidden compartment in Victor Langley's study. Sheer letter from Eliza Grimsby, the missing will, and the creaking gate were threads in a tightening pattern, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them into clarity. Today, she resolved, she would confront a key figure in the mystery, Mrs. Grimsby, whose nervous glances and late-night gate-oiling suggested secrets too heavy to bear. Miss Marple arrived at Langley Manor under the pretence of returning a borrowed teacup, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The manor's heavy oak door opened to reveal Mrs. Grimsby, her gaunt face drawn, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice a touch too sharp. "Mrs. Langley's out, but I can take the cup." Her hands twisted her apron, a habit Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of unease. "Oh, I won't trouble you long," Miss Marple said, her tone as warm as a summer afternoon. "But I thought we might have a little chat. It's been such a trying time, hasn't it? Especially for you, managing the manor through all this." She stepped inside, her eyes noting the faint scent of cleaning fluid and the polished gleam of the hallway floor. Mrs. Grimsby hesitated, then led her to the kitchen, a cavernous room with copper pots hanging like silent sentinels. As she sat, the teacup on the counter, Miss Marple seized her moment. "I found something curious in Victor's study the other day," she said, her voice gentle but deliberate. "A letter, quite old, from an Eliza Grimsby, a relative of yours, perhaps?" The colour drained from Mrs. Grimsby's face, and her hand gripped the counter's edge. "Eliza was my mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that's no business of yours, Miss Marple." "Oh, I don't mean to pry," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with kindly concern. "But the letter mentioned a scandal, a forged document, a debt unpaid. Victor seemed to know about it. I couldn't help but wonder if he was holding it over someone." Mrs. Grimsby's lips trembled, and she turned away, busying herself with a kettle. "Mr. Langley was a hard man," she said at last, her voice low. "He knew about my mother's mistake. Years ago, she forged a cheque to save our family from ruin. Victor found out when he married into the estate. He never let me forget it." She paused, her hands shaking as she poured water. "He'd threatened to tell the village, to ruin my name unless I did as he asked. Extra work, errands, keeping quiet about his business." Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic but her mind sharp. Blackmail, then? A motive as old as the hills? "That must have been dreadful," she said softly. "And the gate? Did he ask you to oil it, to keep his comings and goings? Quiet?" Mrs. Grimsby's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "I oiled it weeks ago, like he told me," she said quickly. "But I didn't touch it the night he died. I swear it, Miss Marple. I was in my room, reading, just as I told. The inspector—" Her voice cracked and she clutched her apron, her knuckles white. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "Though it's odd, isn't it? I heard the gate creak that night, clear as a bell, and again last night during the break-in. Yet you and Mr. Hodges insist it was silent." She let the words hang, watching as Mrs. Grimsby's face crumpled, torn between fear and defiance. "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Grimsby whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "I hated him, yes, but I didn't. I couldn't." She trailed off, sinking into a chair, her hands covering her face. Miss Marple said nothing, her silence a gentle invitation for more, but Mrs. Grimsby offered no further confession. As Miss Marple left the kitchen, she paused by the manor gate, its hinges gleaming with fresh oil. She pushed it gently, and a faint creak answered, softer than before, but unmistakable. Someone had tended to it again, perhaps to cover their tracks after the Will's theft. The footprints in the gravel, now blurred by morning traffic, led toward the rose garden, where Victor had met his end. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, the brass key in her hand. Mrs. Grimsby's admission of blackmail was a vital thread, but her denial of the murder rang true. Her fear was too raw, too unguarded. Yet the gate's creak suggested someone else had used it, someone who knew its habits. Clara's shaky alibi and Edward's gambling debts kept them in the frame, and the missing will pointed to a motive tied to Victor's fortune, or his secrets. The key, Miss Marple thought, was the next step. It likely unlocked the hidden compartment in Victor's desk, where something more valuable than a will might be hidden, perhaps evidence of the scandal, or something that had driven the killer to act. The gate, with its persistent voice, was singing a warning, and Miss Marple was listening. In St. Mary Mead, even the quietest corners held whispers of truth, and she was determined to hear them all. Chapter 11. The Sound of Betrayal. The village hall of St. Mary Mead was aglow with the warmth of lanterns and the hum of conversation, a rare gathering organised under the guise of planning Victor Langley's memorial service. The long tables were laden with teacups, scones, and Mrs. Hartnell's slightly overbaked Victoria sponge. But the true purpose of the evening lay in Miss Jane Marple's quiet orchestration. She sat near the front, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mild blue eyes scanning the room. The creaking gate, the ornate key, and the stolen will were threads in a nearly complete tapestry, and tonight she intended to tug at them until a crucial knot unravelled. The hall was crowded with villagers, their faces a mix of curiosity and condolence. Clara Langley sat at the head table, her black mourning dress pristine, her smile a careful mask of grief. Edward Langley stood by the window, his hands thrust into his pockets, his gaze restless. Mrs. Grimsby, tasked with serving tea, moved stiffly among the crowd, her gaunt face etched with strain. Mr. Hodges, the groundskeeper, lingered near the door, his cap twisted in his hands. Miss Marple noted their positions, her mind mapping their interactions like a pattern in her knitting. The vicar, Mr. Clement, opened the meeting with a sombre speech about Victor's contributions to the village, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She had spread a subtle rumour through Mrs. Hartnell that the police were close to solving the murder, thanks to a clue tied to the manor gate. Gossip, she knew, was a powerful lure, and she watched as whispers rippled through the room, reaching the Langley household. As the discussion turned to memorial plans, Miss Marple rose, her voice gentle but clear. "It's so kind of everyone to come together," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "Poor Victor's passing has left such a mystery. I couldn't help but think of that gate at the manor. It's been so noisy lately, hasn't it? I heard. It creaked the night he died, clear as a bell, though Mr. Hodges and Mrs. Grimsby say it was silent." A hush fell over the room. Clara's teacup clinked against its saucer, and Mrs. Grimsby's tray wobbled, nearly spilling. Mr. Hodges cleared, his throat muttering. Silent it was. Checked it myself. But it was Edward who reacted most sharply, his face flushing as he stepped forward. "That gate's always creaking," he said, his voice tight. "I heard it myself that night, hours before Father was found. Probably just the wind." He stopped, realizing his words too late, his eyes darting to Clara, who stared at him with a mix of shock and fury. Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression one of mild surprise. "Hours before, you say, Edward, but you told Inspector Crane you were at the Red Lion until 11, and Victor was found at dawn. The gate creaked around 9, when I heard voices arguing. Were you at the manor then?" The room stilled, the villager's eyes fixed on Edward. His jaw worked, and he ran a hand through his dark hair. I meant later," he stammered. "Must have misspoken. I was walking, like I said." But his voice lacked conviction, and Clara's gaze hardened, her fingers gripping her handkerchief. Mrs. Grimsby, setting down her tray, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The gate was oiled, Miss Marple. I told you. I did it weeks ago for Mr. Langley. It shouldn't have creaked at all." Her words were meant to deflect, but they only tightened the net. Contradicting Edward's claim, Miss Marple nodded, her tutor smile benign. "How curious," she said. "A gate that creaks for some and not for others. It's almost as if it's choosing who to betray." She let the words linger, watching Clara's forced composure, Edward's growing agitation, and Mrs. Grimsby's pale face. Mr. Hodges shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. As the meeting continued, Miss Marple slipped to the back, her mind racing. Edward's slip was a critical thread. He had placed himself at the manor hours before Victor's body was discovered, contradicting his alibi and aligning with the creak she'd heard during the argument. The gate's sound, silenced by oil yet heard by her, suggested someone had tampered with it to cover their movements, only to have it betray them. The ornate key, still in her possession, likely unlocked the hidden compartment in Victor's desk, perhaps containing evidence of the scandal that had led to his blackmail and his death. Outside, as the villagers dispersed into the cool night, Miss Marple paused by the manor gate, its hinges gleaming faintly. She pushed it gently, and a soft creak answered, a whisper of betrayal in the darkness. Edward's words, Clara's reaction, and Mrs. Grimsby's desperation were pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The gate, she thought, was not just a witness. It was a herald, announcing the killer's every misstep. and Miss Marple was ready to listen to its final note. Chapter 12. The Final Creak. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was thick with anticipation. The village cloaked in a twilight hush, broken only by the distant toll of the church bell. Miss Jane Marple stood by her cottage window, her knitting untouched, her eyes fixed on the lane leading to Langley Manor. Tonight she had set the stage for the final act of the mystery, a reenactment of the night Victor Langley died, designed to make the creaking gate sing its truth. The ornate brass key, the stolen will, and Edward's damning slip at the village gathering had woven a pattern nearly complete, and Miss Marple was ready to pull the final thread. She had enlisted Mr. Hodges, the groundskeeper, under the pretence of testing the manor gate's hinges for the police. Inspector Crane, though sceptical, had agreed to attend, his moustache twitching with impatience. Clara Langley, Edward and Mrs. Grimsby had been invited to the manor's rose garden, ostensibly to clarify the timeline of Victor's death. The villagers, sensing drama, gathered at a discreet distance, their whispers a soft hum in the evening air. As the clock struck 8, Miss Marple joined the group at the manor gate, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her expression one of kindly concern. The rose garden lay beyond, its crimson blooms ghostly in the moonlight. The spot where Victor's body had been found marked by a faint disturbance in the soil. The gate stood silent, its hinges gleaming with fresh oil. But Miss Marple had a plan to change that. "Mr. Hodges," she said, her voice clear but gentle. "You mentioned the gate was silent the night Mr. Langley died, yet I heard it creak, twice, once during an argument, once after. Could you adjust the hinges to replicate how they were that night? It might help us understand what happened." Mr. Hodges, his weathered face creased with confusion, nodded. "I suppose I can, Miss Marple. It was oiled, like I said, but I can loosen it a bit." He set to work with a small wrench, scraping away the oil and tightening a bolt to mimic the gate's condition before Mrs. Grimsby's tampering. The suspects watched, Clara's face a mask of composure, Edward's hands fidgeting, and Mrs. Grimsby's eyes darting nervously to the gate. Miss Marple turned to the group, her tone conversational. "The gate's creak is curious, isn't it? It sang so clearly the night of the murder, yet you all insist it was silent. Edward, you said you heard it hours before Victor was found, placing you here around 9. Clara, you were at the bazaar, or so you claimed. And Mrs. Grimsby, you were reading in your room, despite oiling the gate weeks earlier to keep it quiet." Clara's lips tightened, and Edward's face flushed. Mrs. Grimsby clutched her apron, her voice trembling. "I told you, Miss Marple, I didn't touch the gate that night." Before anyone could respond, Mr. Hodges pushed the gate. A sharp, musical creak pierced the silence, the same note Miss Marple had heard on the murder night. The sound echoed through the garden, and Edward flinched, his eyes wide. Clara's hand froze mid-gesture, and Mrs. Grimsby gasped, stepping back. "Now," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "let's walk through that night. Someone argued with Victor around 9, when I heard voices and the first creak. Someone returned later, after his death, when the gate creaked again, and last night during the break-in it creaked once more." She paused, her eyes sweeping the group. "Someone couldn't resist checking the gate tonight, could they?" As if on cue, Edward bolted toward the gate, his movements frantic. "This is nonsense!" he shouted, pushing it open. The creak rang out again, louder this time, and he froze, realizing his mistake. Inspector Crane stepped forward, his hand on Edward's shoulder. "Stay where you are, Mr. Langley," he said gruffly. Marple's voice was calm but unrelenting. "Edward, you heard the gate that night because you were here, arguing with your father over your gambling debts. The letter in his study about Mrs. Grimsby's mother wasn't the motive, your desperation was. Victor refused to pay your creditors, didn't he? You poisoned him in the rose garden, using the thorns to mask the injection mark on his hand. You oiled the gate to cover your tracks, but it creaked when you fled, betraying you. And the will, stolen to hide your disinheritance, was in that hidden compartment, unlocked by this." She held up the ornate brass key, its floral design glinting in the lantern light. Edward's face crumpled, his bravado gone. "I didn't mean to kill him," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He was going to ruin me, cut me out completely. I lost control." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Mrs. Grimsby sagged against the gate, relief and guilt mingling in her eyes. Inspector Crane handcuffed Edward, his expression a mix of surprise and grudging respect for Miss Marple. The villagers murmured, their gossip now confirmed by the gate's final creak. As Edward was led away, Miss Marple stood by the gate, its hinges still singing softly in the breeze. The key, the will, and the scandal had all played their parts, but it was the gate's voice that had betrayed the murderer, just as she had known it would. Chapter 13. The Truth Beyond the Gate. The morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, softening the edges of the village's stone walls and thatched roofs. Inside her cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm, her tea steaming beside a vase of freshly cut roses. The events of the previous night, the dramatic reenactment at Langley Manor, and Edward Langley's confession, had restored a semblance of peace to the village, though the air still hummed with whispers. The creaking gate, the ornate key, and the stolen will had unravelled a murderer's secrets, and Miss Marple was ready to explain how. Inspector Crane had requested her presence at the police station to clarify a few points, a rare admission of her pivotal role. She arrived promptly, her tweed skirt impeccable, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The station's small office was cluttered with files, and Crane sat behind his desk, his moustache less bristly today, his eyes betraying a grudging respect. Clara Langley and Mrs. Grimsby were there too, seated stiffly, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. "Miss Marple," Crane began, clearing his throat, "you've got a knack for this, I'll give you that. But I need to understand how you knew it was Edward, and how that blasted gate gave him away." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "It was the gate, Inspector, that told the story. Gates, you see, are like people. They have habits, and when they change, it's rarely by accident." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but precise. "The night Victor died, I heard the gate creak twice, once during an argument around 9, once later after his death. Yet Mr. Hodges and Mrs. Grimsby insisted it was silent, oiled weeks earlier to keep it quiet. She paused, letting the words settle. Mrs. Grimsby admitted to oiling it at Victor's request, likely to conceal his own secretive comings and goings. But Edward, desperate over his gambling debts and Victor's threat to disinherit him, tampered with it again. He loosened the hinges to make it creak, perhaps to mislead anyone listening, or because he didn't know how to oil it properly. That creak betrayed his presence during the argument, when he poisoned Victor with an injection, masked by the thorn mark on his hand. Clara's face paled, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "Edward, I knew he was troubled, but I never thought—" Her voice broke, and Miss Marple's expression softened with sympathy. "The will," Miss Marple continued, "was stolen to hide Victor's decision to cut Edward out. The ornate key I found, dropped by Edward during his midnight visit, unlocked a hidden compartment in the study desk, where Victor kept evidence of his blackmail, including the letter about Mrs. Grimsby's mother, Eliza. Edward feared that evidence would expose his motive, so he broke in, forcing the drawer when the key alone wasn't enough." Mrs. Grimsby's shoulders sagged, her eyes brimming. "I should have spoken up," she whispered. "Victor held that letter over me for years, threatening to ruin my name. I oiled the gate to keep his secrets, but I never meant for this." "You weren't to blame, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Edward's desperation drove him, and the gate betrayed him. Its creak, deliberate or not, marked his every move, arguing with Victor, fleeing after the murder, and returning for the will. It was a witness that couldn't lie." Crane scribbled in his notebook, muttering, "Remarkable." He cleared his throat again. "We found the will hidden in Edward's room, just as you suspected. It confirmed Victor's intent to leave the estate to Clara, with nothing for Edward. The poison was traced to a vial in his car, a rare toxin easily concealed." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "In a village like St. Mary Mead, small things speak loudly. The gate's voice was the loudest of all." As she left the station, the village was settling back into its routine, the gossip now tempered with awe at her deduction. She paused by the Langley gate, its hinges still faintly oiled but creaking softly under her touch. The rose garden beyond lay serene, its thorns no longer hiding a murderer's secret. Clara would rebuild. Mrs. Grimsby would find peace, and Edward would face justice. But Miss Marple knew that other gates in St. Mary Mead held their own secrets, waiting for a creak to reveal them. Back at her cottage, she sat by her window, her knitting forming a new pattern. The village was quiet, but not silent. There were always whispers, always threads to unravel, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and patient heart, would be ready to listen when the next gate creaked.